He wrapped strangers in horse blankets and boiled snow for coffee while the storm buried his farm. The bikers sat silent, watching the trembling widower feed his last logs into the stove. Everyone thought they'd vanish at first light, but the roar of engines at dawn brought something the old man's town had never seen. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. 3 days before the blizzard arrived, 76-year-old Howard Mitchell stood in the doorway of his weathered farmhouse and stared at the yellow foreclosure notice nailed to the wood like a death sentence. 30 days to vacate. The words blurred as his arthritic fingers traced the cracked paint around the doorframe, paint that Clara had chosen 40 years ago. A soft cream color, she said, would make the house feel warm even in the coldest months. The farm stretched out before him in the November gray. 200 acres of Michigan land that had belonged to his family for 3 generations, now slipping through his fingers like the first snow that would soon fall. The barn leaned slightly to the left, its red paint peeling in long strips that curled like dried leaves. The roof sagging under years of neglect and one too many brutal winters. Fence posts stood crooked or broken. The barbed wire between them rusted and slack. And the ancient tractor near the equipment shed hadn't run in 2 years, its tires flat and cracked, its body slowly being consumed by rust and time. Howard walked across the yard, his boots crunching on frozen ground, and pushed open the barn door with a groan of old hinges that echoed in the empty space. Inside, Clara's belongings sat exactly where he had placed them 2 years ago, when cancer had finally taken her from him after 48 years of marriage, the longest and shortest time of his life. Her quilts were folded in neat stacks on wooden shelves he had built for her decades ago, each one a masterpiece of color and pattern, each stitch a testament to her patience and love. The wedding ring quilt they had received as a gift lay on top, its interlocking circles faded but still beautiful, and Howard reached out to touch it with fingers that trembled not from the cold but from the weight of memory. Chemotherapy, radiation, hospital stays, experimental treatments that insurance refused to cover, prescription medications that cost more than his monthly pension. He had sold the cattle first, then the pigs, then most of the equipment, watching piece by piece as the farm died along with his wife. For 5 years before her diagnosis, the farm had barely broken even. Small family operations crushed by industrial agriculture and rising costs, but he had kept going because that was what you did, you kept going. Now the bank had finally lost patience, and Mr. Peterson from First National had delivered the foreclosure papers himself, unable to meet Howard's eyes, mumbling apologies that meant nothing against the black and white reality of unpaid debts. Howard's veteran's pension from his time as an army medic in Vietnam covered his utilities and basic food. But it was not enough to save the farm, not enough to pay the mortgage that had ballooned with equity loans taken out to pay for Clara's care. He had not told anyone in town about the foreclosure, could not bear the pity in their eyes or the well-meaning offers of help that he was too proud to accept. He was a private man, always had been, the kind who solved his own problems and carried his own burdens without complaint. He and Clara had never had children, a sorrow they had learned to live with. And now there was no one to inherit this land, no one to care that it was being lost. Howard returned to the house as the November sun began to set, the sky turning gray and heavy, and he sat in his worn armchair listening to the old radio on the kitchen counter crackle with static. The weather report broke through the noise with words that sent a chill down his spine, colder than the draft coming through the poorly sealed windows. "Historic blizzard approaching," the announcer said. "Possibly the worst storm in 50 years. Expected to arrive within 24 hours. Residents advised to stock up on supplies and prepare for extended power outages and impassable roads." Howard looked around his kitchen at the nearly bare shelves, at the handful of canned goods that remained, at the small pile of firewood outside his back door that would maybe last 2 days if he was careful. He had been meaning to buy more supplies, but every dollar was counted now. Every purchase weighed against the futility of planning for a future that seemed to be closing in around him. The next day, the storm arrived with a violence that took even the forecasters by surprise. Howard woke to a world transformed, the temperature having dropped 20 degrees overnight, the wind howling around the house like a living thing trying to find a way inside. The first snowflakes were small and tentative, dancing in the gray morning light. But within an hour they had become a solid wall of white that erased the world beyond his windows. He moved through the house with the efficiency of a man who had survived 76 Michigan winters, filling every pot and bucket with water before the pipes froze, gathering his remaining firewood and stacking it by the stove, lighting oil lamps as the electricity flickered and died. The storm intensified beyond anything the reports had predicted. The wind screaming around the eaves with a sound like tortured souls, the snow falling so thick and fast that visibility dropped to zero. By afternoon, Howard could not see the barn from his kitchen window, could not see anything but the swirling white chaos that had swallowed his world. The power lines went down somewhere in the early evening, plunging the house into a darkness broken only by the oil lamps and the glow from the wood stove. Howard sat in his chair wrapped in 2 threadbare sweaters, and the Afghan Clara had crocheted during her last autumn, the one she had finished just weeks before the diagnosis, its yarn soft and warm against his skin, but unable to keep out the cold that seeped through every crack and gap in the old house. He opened a can of vegetable soup and heated it on the wood stove, the thin broth barely enough to fill his hollow stomach. But he ate it slowly, making it last, knowing he needed to ration what little remained. His thoughts drifted as he watched the fire burn low. Thoughts of selling the furniture to buy a few more weeks. Thoughts of calling the bank to beg for an extension he knew they would not grant. Thoughts of Clara and how she would have faced this crisis with her quiet strength and unwavering faith that things would work out somehow. The night fell heavy and complete, the storm raging outside with undiminished fury. And Howard added another log to the fire, watching it catch and flare, knowing he was burning through his supply too fast but unable to bear the cold. The second day of the blizzard passed in a blur of white and gray, time losing meaning in the monotony of wind and snow. And by evening, Howard sat dozing in his chair, wrapped in blankets. The fire burned down to embers because he had only 3 logs left and needed to make them last through the night. The violent pounding on his door jerked him from the edge of sleep, his heart hammering in his chest as he struggled to orient himself in the dim lamplight. Who would be out in this storm, he thought, fear mixing with concern as he pushed himself up from the chair, his joints protesting, his body stiff from cold and age. The pounding came again, desperate and urgent, and Howard shuffled to the door, his hand hesitating on the latch for just a moment before he pulled it open. The blast of wind and snow nearly knocked him backward, and through the swirling white he saw 15 figures, dark shapes covered in snow and ice, leather-clad and enormous, their motorcycles barely visible behind them in the storm, like metal skeletons half buried in drifts. The man in front stepped forward, tall and broad-shouldered, his neck covered in tattoos that disappeared into his collar, ice clinging to his beard. And when he spoke, his voice was rough and desperate. "Our bikes died," he said through lips that barely moved, frozen and blue. "We need shelter. Please." Howard did not hesitate, his medic training from 50 years ago taking over, assessing hypothermia and frostbite in an instant. "Get inside before you freeze to death," he said, stepping back and pulling the door wide. The bikers filed in one after another, 15 men and women ranging in age from 20s to 50s, all of them shivering violently, their leather jackets and pants crusted with ice, their faces red and raw from the wind. Howard's small house could not hold them all, so he directed them through the kitchen and out the back door to the barn, shouting to be heard over the storm, telling them to remove their wet leather and wrap themselves in the blankets and quilts he had stored there. He followed them into the barn, the wind tearing at his thin sweaters, and showed them where Clara's quilts were stacked, the horse blankets he had not used since selling his last mare 3 years ago, telling them to huddle together for warmth, to get dry and stay covered. Back in the house, Howard boiled snow on his wood stove for hot water, the process taking forever as he filled pot after pot from the drifts outside his door, his hands going numb despite the gloves he pulled on. He made weak coffee from the last grounds in his cupboard, the liquid barely brown, barely warm. But it was something. He brought the bikers into his kitchen in shifts, the house too small for more than 4 or 5 at a time, and watched them cup the tin mugs in their shaking hands, watched the steam rise into their grateful faces. He opened his final cans, beans and soup and vegetables, everything he had left, and heated them on the stove, spooning the food into bowls and passing them out, insisting the strangers eat first, waving away their protests. The bikers watched him with eyes that saw everything, noticed his trembling arthritic hands as he worked, his hollow cheeks that spoke of too many skipped meals, the bare cupboards with their empty shelves, the foreclosure notice still pinned to the wall by the door. The leader, the one with the tattooed neck who had introduced himself simply as Marcus, stood in the corner and observed the small kitchen with an intensity that Howard felt but did not question, Marcus's eyes moving from the wedding photo on the wall to the Purple Heart in its dusty frame above the sink, to the stack of medical bills on the counter weighed down by an empty wallet, to Howard himself, as he fed the last 3 logs into the wood stove and said quietly that it would be enough to last the night. A woman biker, her face weathered but kind, her short hair plastered to her head from melted snow, caught Howard's arm as he moved past. "You haven't eaten anything," she said, and Howard recognized concern in her voice. Her name was Ruth, she had told him, and there was something in her eyes that said she understood hardship, understood pride, understood the cost of survival. Howard smiled and patted her hand, his own hand so thin that his wedding ring spun loose on his finger. "I ate earlier," he lied gently. "The barn is warm enough with all of you together and the blankets," he told them. "You will be fine until morning." The bikers settled in the barn as the night deepened, and through the walls Howard could hear their voices, low and indistinct, the sound of whispered conversations he could not make out. He returned to his bedroom and lay down fully clothed on top of the covers, pulling Clara's Afghan and 2 other thin blankets over himself, shivering in the darkness. He did not regret helping these strangers, would do it again without hesitation, because that was what Clara would have done, what any decent person should do when another human being was in need. He wondered if he should call the bank in the morning, try to explain, try to beg for 30 more days, though he knew it would change nothing. The farm was lost, his life as he had known it was ending, and all he could do was wait for the final blow to fall. In the barn, the bikers sat huddled under Clara's quilts, their voices rising and falling in the darkness. Marcus pulled a satellite phone from his pack, the small detail barely noticed by the others, and made a call that lasted only minutes. The other bikers whispered among themselves, their words carrying in the cold air. "Boss, did you see that foreclosure notice?" one of them said. "The man gave us everything," another added. "He is a vet. Look at that medal," a third voice chimed in. Marcus's response was quiet but firm, his voice carrying the weight of decision and purpose. "I saw," he said. "Get some sleep. We have work to do at dawn." The mystery of his words hung in the air as the bikers settled into restless sleep, the storm continuing to rage outside, the snow piling 6 feet high against the barn walls, and the house burying the farm in white silence. Howard drifted into troubled sleep, his dreams filled with images of Clara young and smiling, her hands moving over fabric as she stitched another quilt, her voice telling him that everything would be all right, that they would find a way through this as they had found a way through everything else. When first light finally broke through the gray dawn, the storm began to die, the wind dropping from a scream to a whisper, the snow finally stopping after 2 days of relentless assault. In the barn, engines began to start. Not just the 15 motorcycles, but other engines. Truck engines. The deep rumble of diesel motors, the sound growing and multiplying until it seemed like an army was gathering in Howard's small farmyard. And the old man stirred in his bed, confused and disoriented, not understanding what he was hearing or what was about to change his life forever. Howard woke to a sound that made no sense in the silence that should have followed the storm, a rumbling that started low and distant, but grew into a thunder that shook the farmhouse windows and seemed to come from everywhere at once. He lay confused in his bed for a long moment, his body stiff from the cold and the hard mattress, his mind still foggy with dreams of Clara, until the sound penetrated his consciousness and pulled him fully awake with a jolt of alarm. These were not the 15 motorcycle engines he had expected, but dozens of engines. The deep diesel rumble of heavy trucks, the higher pitch of work vans, the grinding of gears and the beep of vehicles backing up, a symphony of machinery that had no business being on his remote farm on a winter morning after the worst blizzard in 50 years. Howard struggled out of bed, his joints protesting every movement, and shuffled to the window, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air of the bedroom. What he saw through the frost-covered glass stopped his heart and stole the breath from his lungs. His small farm had been transformed overnight into something resembling a military operation or a construction site of impossible scale. At least 30 vehicles filled his yard and the field beyond. Pickup trucks with their beds loaded high with lumber and supplies, flatbeds carrying stacks of shingles and bundles of materials he could not identify, work vans with company logos on their sides, even a cement mixer turning slowly, its drum catching the weak morning light. 50 or more people moved through the snow with purpose and precision, unloading materials in organized piles, setting up equipment, marking out areas with stakes and string, and through it all the 15 bikers moved like generals, directing an army, pointing and gesturing, calling out instructions that were lost in the noise, but clearly understood by everyone who heard them. Howard pressed his face closer to the cold glass, his eyes wide, his mouth open in shock, and the only words that escaped his lips were a whispered prayer or curse. What in God's name is happening? He turned from the window and rushed to dress, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely button his shirt, pulling on his worn pants and his boots, grabbing his heaviest coat from the hook by the door, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. He burst out of the house into the bitter cold, the morning air hitting his lungs like ice water, and stumbled through snow that came up to his knees, the drifts from the blizzard still deep and unbroken, except where the vehicles had plowed rough paths. He made his way toward the center of the chaos, where Marcus stood tall and commanding, a clipboard in one gloved hand, directing 2 younger men who were unloading 2x4s from a truck. Howard reached him breathless and bewildered, his voice coming out louder than he intended, asking, "What is this? What are you doing?" The words tumbling over each other in his confusion and alarm. Marcus turned to face him, and his expression was serious but warm, his dark eyes meeting Howard's pale blue ones with a steadiness that was almost unsettling. He told Howard good morning, said there was coffee brewing in that truck over there, the heated one with the red stripe. Suggested that Howard should eat something first because they had brought breakfast, real food, eggs and bacon and fresh bread. Howard shook his head, unable to process the mundane offer of breakfast when his entire world had been invaded by strangers and machines. He protested that he did not understand, said the storm was over. They could leave now, asked again what all of this was, his voice rising with each question. Marcus gestured to the organized chaos around them, to the workers who moved with efficiency and skill, to the mountains of materials being sorted and distributed, and he said simply that Howard had saved 15 lives last night, and they were returning the favor. Howard felt his legs go weak beneath him, felt the weight of those words settle on his chest like a physical thing. He insisted that he did not need payment, that he had just done what anyone would do, what any decent human being would do when faced with people freezing to death. Marcus's expression shifted, became more intense, and he spoke with quiet conviction that cut through all of Howard's protests. He said that not everyone would have done what Howard did, that most people would have turned them away, looked at 15 leather-clad strangers and seen danger instead of human beings in need. He pointed out that Howard had fed them his last food, burned his last wood, given everything he had to people he did not know and had no reason to trust. He said that a stranger does not do that without a good heart, and good hearts deserve to be honored. Marcus took Howard's elbow gently and guided him through the snow to a large trailer that had been set up near the barn, its door open and warm air spilling out into the frozen morning. Inside, the trailer was heated and bright, with a small table and chairs, a coffee maker burbling in the corner, the smell of fresh coffee so rich and real that Howard felt tears spring to his eyes. Marcus poured coffee into a sturdy mug and pressed it into Howard's trembling hands, then sat him down in one of the chairs and took the seat across from him. He began to speak, and as he spoke, the mystery that had haunted the long night began to unravel into a truth more profound than Howard could have imagined. Marcus revealed his full name, Marcus Chen, and explained that he was the owner of Chen Construction Group, a company worth $40 million with operations across 3 states. The other bikers, he said, were not just riders but contractors and electricians and plumbers and business owners, all of them successful in their own right, all of them part of a network that came together each year for a winter charity ride to help those in need. They had been caught in the storm, their bikes dying in the cold, and they had stumbled onto Howard's farm by pure chance or fate or divine intervention, whatever name you wanted to give to the forces that guide our lives. But there was more, Marcus said, and he pulled out his phone, scrolled through photos, and turned the screen toward Howard. The image showed a much younger Howard in Army medic uniform, his face unlined and earnest, his dark hair cut military short, standing with other soldiers in jungle fatigues, somewhere hot and green and dangerous. Howard stared at the photo, his mind reeling, trying to understand how this stranger had a picture from 57 years ago, from a life he had tried so hard to leave behind. Marcus asked if that was him. Asked if he had served in the 70th Medical Detachment in Vietnam in 1968. Howard nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with confusion and the beginning of understanding. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost reverent, and he told Howard about his father, David Chen, who had served in that same unit. David had told Marcus a story his entire life, a story about the medic who had carried him 3 miles through enemy fire after he had been shot, the medic who had refused to leave him behind even when the situation was hopeless, who had dragged him to safety and kept him alive through sheer force of will and skill. Marcus explained that David Chen had died 5 years ago, but before he died he had made Marcus promise to find Howard Mitchell, if he ever could, to find the man who had given him his life and say thank you. Last night, Marcus said, when he had stood in Howard's kitchen and seen the Purple Heart on the wall, when he had seen the name on the medical bills and the mail stacked on the counter, when he had pieced together the age and the service and the location, he had realized that the man who had sheltered them from the storm was the same man his father had never stopped searching for. Howard felt the world tilt beneath him, felt 57 years collapse into this single moment in a heated trailer on a frozen farm. He barely remembered David Chen, could barely pull a face from the hundreds of faces he had treated and carried and saved during that terrible year in the jungle. He tried to explain that he had just been doing his job. That was what medics did. You did not leave people behind. You did not let them die if you could prevent it. Marcus shook his head slowly, his eyes bright with emotion he was trying to hold back. He told Howard that his father had built a successful restaurant business after the war because Howard had given him his life back, had put Marcus through college, had lived to see 3 granddaughters born. He said that everything he had, everything his family had, existed because Howard had not left David Chen to die in that jungle 57 years ago. The weight of those words broke something loose inside Howard, and he felt panic rising in his chest. He told Marcus that he did not have anything, that he was losing this farm, that he could not pay them back for the materials or the labor or any of this impossible generosity. Marcus cut him off, his voice firm but gentle, and said that Howard had already paid 57 years ago in a jungle half a world away, and he had paid again last night by proving that David Chen had been right about him all along. Marcus revealed the plan they had made in those whispered conversations in the barn, the phone calls on the satellite phone while Howard slept in his cold bedroom. They had seen the foreclosure notice, had understood immediately what it meant. The motorcycle club, Marcus explained, was not just a group of riders but a network of contractors who did annual charity builds, who came together to help veterans and elderly people in need, and they were going to pay off Howard's mortgage in full, rebuild his farm, restore everything that had fallen into disrepair. Howard felt his pride rise up like a wall, felt 76 years of self-reliance and independence rebel against the idea of accepting what he saw as charity. He said he could not accept it, said he was not a beggar, said it with all the dignity he could muster, even as his voice shook and his eyes filled with tears he refused to shed. Marcus's expression softened, and he spoke with a gentleness that was more devastating than any argument. He said it was not charity, it was family taking care of family, and his father had considered Howard his brother, had spoken of him with reverence and love for 40 years. The other bikers began to gather at the trailer door, drawn by some invisible signal, and one by one they stepped inside or stood in the doorway, adding their voices to Marcus's. Ruth, the woman who had noticed Howard's hunger the night before, revealed that she was a veteran too, had been homeless for 2 years after her discharge, had been too proud to accept help until Marcus had found her and given her a job and a purpose. She said she knew what it was like to carry everything alone, to think that accepting help made you weak. But she had learned that sometimes strength means letting others lift you up. Another biker, a man named Thomas with gray in his beard and scars on his hands, told the story of his grandfather who had died in a blizzard 30 years ago because no one had opened their door, because people had been afraid or too busy or too concerned with their own problems to help a stranger in need. He said that Howard's act of kindness had saved 15 lives but also healed something broken in all of them, reminded them why they did this work, why they came together each year to build and repair and restore. The emotional weight became too much for Howard to bear, the accumulation of grief and loss and loneliness and fear that he had carried for 2 years since Clara's death, the weight of watching his farm die and his future disappear, the weight of pride that had kept him from asking for help even as he drowned. He collapsed into tears, his shoulders shaking, his hands covering his face, and through his sobs he said the words he had never said aloud, said that Clara had died and he could not save her, that he had failed her, that he could not even keep her farm alive, the land she had loved and tended and filled with her presence. Marcus dropped to his knees beside Howard's chair and placed a hand on the old man's shoulder, and his voice when he spoke was thick with his own tears. He said that they would help Howard save the farm now, that they would honor Clara's memory by making this place beautiful again, by filling it with life and purpose and hope. Through his tears, Howard felt something break and shift inside him, felt the rigid pride that had held him together begin to dissolve, and he nodded, unable to speak, able only to accept what was being offered with a humility that hurt and healed at the same time. The workers outside had already begun in earnest, the sound of hammers and saws filling the cold morning air, the sound of rebuilding and restoration, the sound of 15 lives saved, returning to save one life in ways that had nothing to do with shelter from a storm and everything to do with shelter from despair. Within hours of the sun rising fully over the transformed farmyard, word began to spread through the small town, like ripples moving outward from a stone dropped in still water. The sound of machinery and the sight of smoke rising from Howard's property drew attention first from his nearest neighbors, then from those who passed by on the county road that bordered his land, and soon cars began to arrive, crunching through the plowed snow, parking wherever they could find space along the roadside. Neighbors came first. People Howard had known for decades but had kept at arm's length in recent years, their faces showing confusion and curiosity as they approached the organized chaos of construction. Shop owners from town arrived during their lunch breaks. The pastor from the Methodist church drove out in his old sedan. And then the sheriff's cruiser pulled up, with lights flashing, the lawman stepping out with a hand on his belt and concern etched on his weathered face. Sheriff Martin had received calls about a biker gang taking over the Mitchell farm, and he approached with caution until he saw not violence or theft, but 50 people working with precision and purpose, unloading materials and operating equipment with the efficiency of professionals. He found Marcus directing a crew near the barn and asked what exactly was happening here. and Marcus explained calmly about the storm and the shelter and the debt being repaid, and the sheriff's suspicion melted into something like wonder. Then another car arrived, a black sedan that belonged to the bank, and Mr. Peterson emerged in his suit and tie, looking entirely out of place in the construction site. He made his way to where Marcus stood, and his voice carried an edge of authority when he announced that this property was in foreclosure, and whatever was happening here needed to stop immediately until the legal matters were resolved. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder of papers, handing them to Peterson with a calm expression that held just a trace of satisfaction. He told the banker that the property was not in foreclosure anymore, that the mortgage had been paid in full as of 7 o'clock that morning, and the papers Peterson now held contained the wire transfer confirmation and the legal documents releasing the lien. Peterson's face went through a series of changes as he read the documents. Confusion giving way to shock, giving way to something that might have been shame, and he looked up at Howard, who stood nearby watching the exchange, with his arms wrapped around himself against the cold. Peterson asked why Howard had never told anyone in town that he was in trouble, why he had suffered alone when people could have helped, and Howard's response was quiet and tinged with embarrassment as he said he had not wanted to be a burden on anyone. The neighbors who had gathered close enough to hear this exchange reacted with a mixture of emotions that played across their faces like clouds moving across the sky. There was guilt in their eyes because they had not noticed or had not looked closely enough to see their neighbor drowning in debt and grief. There was anger directed inward because they had been so caught up in their own lives that they had failed to see someone in need right in their midst. And there was determination that sparked and grew as they looked at the bikers and workers who had come from nowhere to do what the town should have done. And one by one, the townspeople began asking how they could help. Dorothy, who owned the diner on Main Street, returned an hour later with her pickup truck bed filled with containers of hot food, sandwiches and soup, and coffee in thermoses, telling everyone that no one was going to work on an empty stomach. Gerald, who ran the hardware store, drove back to his shop and returned with additional supplies, boxes of nails and screws and caulking that he donated without asking for payment, telling Marcus that his money was no good here, that the town took care of its own. More townspeople arrived as the morning wore into afternoon, and they came not to watch but to work, holding ladders for the roofers, clearing snow from areas that needed to be accessed, bringing tools from their own garages and sheds. A group of young people from the high school appeared just after noon, 15 teenagers who had been given permission by their principal to leave school for the afternoon and receive community service credit for helping with the project. The scenes that unfolded throughout that first full day were a study in collaboration and connection. Bikers in their leather working alongside farmers in their overalls, teenagers learning how to use power tools from experienced contractors, women from the church bringing Clara's quilts from the barn and taking them home to wash and restore them with the same care Clara had used to create them. Howard moved through it all in a daze of disbelief and gratitude, watching as his dying farm came back to life under the hands of strangers and neighbors alike. Marcus found him standing by the old tractor late in the afternoon and told him that people want to help. They just needed someone to show them how, and Howard realized that the bikers had not just saved his farm, but had shown his community how to be a community again. The work continued over the following days with a rhythm and purpose that transformed the farm one project at a time. On the first day, crews tackled the roof of the house, tearing off old damaged shingles and replacing them with new ones that gleamed in the winter sun, sealing leaks that had let water damage the attic for years, rebuilding the chimney that had been crumbling brick by brick. On the second day, the focus shifted to the barn, where workers installed new support beams to shore up the sagging structure, replaced the roof entirely with metal sheeting that would last for decades, and organized Clara's storage area into a proper workshop with shelves and workbenches built from fresh lumber. On the third day, painters transformed the house from its faded, peeling exterior into a gleaming white structure that looked like it belonged in a magazine, while inside other workers repaired windows that had been stuck shut for years, fixed plumbing that had leaked and groaned, and installed a new furnace that filled the house with warmth. Howard had almost forgotten existed. On the fourth day, a crew worked on the perimeter of the property, replacing broken and rotting fence posts with new treated lumber, stringing fresh wire between them, grading the driveway, and laying new gravel that crunched satisfyingly under tires and boots. On the fifth day, the final touches came together, landscaping that would look beautiful when spring arrived, a new front porch built with care and craftsmanship that extended the full width of the house with railings and steps that did not creak or sag. Throughout all of this, Howard found himself drawn into conversations with the workers during their breaks, learning their stories and sharing pieces of his own. Ruth told him about her journey from homelessness to project manager, how she had served 2 tours in Iraq and come home to find that civilian life had no place for her skills, how she had lived in her car and then in shelters until Marcus had found her at a veterans event and offered her a job and a chance to rebuild her life along with the lives of others. Thomas shared his story of recovery from addiction, how he had lost everything to pills and alcohol, how he had been days away from dying when a stranger had driven him to a treatment center and paid for his first month, how he had been sober for 8 years now and dedicated his life to helping others the way he had been helped. The young workers talked about their futures with a hopefulness that reminded Howard of his own youth. Their plans for college or trade school or military service, their dreams of making something meaningful with their lives. Howard began cooking for the workers on the third day, using the food that townspeople had donated to fill his once empty pantry, making simple meals of stew and chili and sandwiches that he served from his kitchen to anyone who was hungry. He found purpose in this act of feeding others, found that Clara's spirit lived on in the act of providing sustenance and care, and the workers thanked him not just for the food, but for the chance to sit in his warm kitchen and feel like they belonged to something larger than themselves. On the fourth day, Marcus took Howard to the barn and asked him to close his eyes, then led him by the arm to the workshop section where Clara's storage had been. When Howard opened his eyes, he saw that the space had been completely transformed, filled with new woodworking tools still gleaming with factory oil, workbenches built at the perfect height, good lighting installed overhead, and storage organized with precision. Marcus explained that Clara's quilts were safely in the house now, restored and displayed with the honor they deserved. But this space needed new life, too. He revealed that they had enrolled Howard in a program that taught woodworking skills to veterans, helped them create furniture and crafts that could be sold at markets and online, gave them both an income and a purpose. He also explained that they had arranged for a local youth program to partner with Howard, bringing young people to the farm to learn agricultural skills and animal husbandry and the kind of practical knowledge that was being lost in the modern world. Marcus told Howard that he had knowledge worth sharing, experience and wisdom that could shape young lives, and that Clara was gone, but her spirit of caring could continue through Howard's teaching and mentoring. Howard stood in the workshop with tears streaming down his face, understanding finally that they were not just saving his farm but giving him a future, a reason to wake up each morning, a way to honor Clara's memory by passing forward the love and care she had shown to everyone she met. His eyes fell on a handmade sign hanging above the main workbench, wood burned with careful letters that read, "Clara's Corner, where hands build hope," and he touched the sign with trembling fingers and felt Clara's presence so strongly that he could almost hear her voice telling him that this was right, this was good, this was how life should be lived. The final day of construction arrived 1 week after the blizzard had trapped 15 strangers in Howard's barn, and the transformation was so complete that people who had known the farm for decades barely recognized it. The barn stood tall and proud with its new red paint gleaming. The house shone white against the snow with its new porch and repaired shutters. The fences marched straight and strong across the property line. Paths had been cleared and would stay clear with the new snowblower that had been delivered that morning. The garden area had been prepared for spring planting, with fresh soil and composted manure, and a greenhouse kit had been assembled near the southern exposure of the barn. Inside the house, donated furniture filled rooms that had been nearly empty. The pantry overflowed with food that would last for months. New appliances hummed efficiently in the kitchen, and every room was warm and clean and felt lived in again. As the sun began to set on that final day, Everyone gathered in front of the house. Workers and townspeople and bikers all standing together in the cold evening air, their breath forming clouds that rose and dissipated in the dimming light. Howard stood on his new porch with Marcus beside him, and Marcus held out a wrapped package that Howard opened with shaking hands. Inside was a framed photograph of a young man in army uniform, his face unlined and hopeful, his smile wide and genuine. And Howard recognized David Chen even though he had not seen that face in 57 years. The inscription on the frame read, "To the medic who gave me tomorrow, find yours. David Chen." Howard held the photograph against his chest and let the tears flow freely. No longer ashamed of his emotion, no longer trying to hold everything inside, he looked out at the crowd of faces, some familiar and some new, all of them waiting. And he began to speak. His voice was rough at first, but grew stronger as he thanked everyone for what they had done, for seeing him when he had tried so hard to be invisible, for refusing to let him face his darkness alone. He talked about Clara and how she had always believed that people were fundamentally good, that they wanted to help each other if only they knew how. That kindness was not weakness, but the strongest force in the world. He talked about second chances and how he had thought his life was over, how he had been preparing to lose everything, how he had opened his door to strangers not knowing that he was opening his door to salvation. He talked about kindness rippling outward like those rings on water, how one act leads to another, how David Chen's life had led to Marcus's success, which had led to this moment, how his own simple act of shelter had sparked something that transformed not just his farm, but his entire community. His final words came from somewhere deep inside, from a place of truth that could not be denied, and he told them that he had thought he was just opening his door to strangers, but he had not known he was opening his door to family. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, and people came forward to embrace Howard and shake his hand and tell him that they were glad he was staying, that the town needed him, that they would not forget this lesson about seeing each other and helping each other and being the family that everyone needs. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear in the cold, clear air, the bikers began preparing to leave, loading their gear onto their motorcycles, checking their equipment, saying their goodbyes to the workers and townspeople they had labored beside. Engines began to rev, that distinctive rumble of motorcycles preparing for the road, and Howard felt a pang of loss at their departure even though he knew this moment had to come. But Marcus caught his eye and smiled. And Howard understood that this was not an ending but a beginning, that the connections forged over this week would endure, that some debts can never be fully repaid because they transform into something larger than debt. They become love. They become family. They become the stories we tell to remind ourselves of who we can be when we choose compassion over fear. The morning after the construction was completed, the bikers began packing their gear with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before, loading saddlebags and securing equipment to their motorcycles while the early sun cast long shadows across the transformed farm. Howard emerged from his warm house, still marveling at the furnace that worked and the windows that did not rattle in their frames, and he moved among the bikers saying goodbye to people who had become more than strangers in the span of a week. Ruth found him first and wrapped him in a fierce embrace, her strong arms holding him tight as she promised to visit in the spring and check on his progress with the workshop. Thomas approached next and pressed something into Howard's palm. A small wooden cross he had carved himself during the evening hours, its surface smooth and warm, telling Howard to keep it as a reminder that God puts people in our path when we need them most. One by one, the others came to shake his hand or hug him, or simply nod with understanding that transcended words. And then Marcus was the last one standing before him, tall and solid in his leather jacket, his eyes reflecting something profound that Howard recognized as the completion of a circle that had begun 57 years ago in a jungle half a world away. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, handing it to Howard with both hands, as if it were something sacred. He told Howard not to open it until they were gone, asked him to trust him one more time. And Howard took the envelope and nodded because trust had been earned and re-earned throughout this impossible week. The convoy of motorcycles and trucks began to pull away, engines rumbling in harmony, horns honking in farewell, and the townspeople who had gathered to see them off waved and cheered as the vehicles disappeared down the county road, one after another, until the sound faded into the distance, and the morning was quiet again. Howard stood on his new porch, the envelope heavy in his hands, and he watched the empty road for a long time before he finally looked down and broke the seal. Inside he found the deed to his farm, stamped and notarized with the words "Paid in full" across the top, in official ink that made it real and permanent. There were bank statements showing an account opened in his name containing $50,000, an amount so large that Howard had to read it 3 times to believe it was true. And there was a letter, handwritten on good paper. And Howard sat down on the porch steps because his legs would no longer hold him, and he began to read. The letter was from Marcus, his handwriting neat and careful, and it explained that the money was from David Chen's estate, money that David had set aside specifically for Howard Mitchell, if he could ever be found. David had been searching for Howard for years, Marcus wrote, hiring investigators and searching military records, writing letters to veterans organizations, never giving up hope that he could find the medic who had saved his life and say thank you one more time. He had died 5 years ago without finding Howard. But he had made Marcus promise to continue the search. And Marcus had done exactly that, finally locating Howard through VA records just 2 months before the blizzard. He had been planning to visit in the spring, Marcus explained, but the storm had brought them together in a way that felt like fate or divine intervention, or whatever name you wanted to give to the mysterious forces that guide our lives toward the moments that define us. The core message of the letter came in words that Howard would read 1,000 times in the months and years to come. "My father taught me that debts of the heart outlive us," Marcus had written. "We pass them forward, not back. You saved my father. Now save someone else." That is all he would want. The letter instructed Howard to use the money to keep the farm running, to start the youth program they had discussed, to teach others what he knew about survival and resilience and the quiet dignity of working with your hands. The final line was simple but profound, a promise that settled into Howard's chest like a warm light. "You are not alone anymore, Howard. You never will be again." Howard wept as he sat on the porch with the letter in his hands. But these were not the tears of grief and despair that he had cried so many times since Clara's death. These were tears of hope, tears of gratitude, tears of a man who had been pulled back from the edge of darkness and given a reason to believe in tomorrow. 3 months passed and spring arrived with an exuberance that transformed the Michigan landscape from white and gray to green and gold. The snow melted in rushing streams that fed the creek at the back of Howard's property, and the garden he planted with help from his new students burst into life with rows of vegetables and herbs that Clara would have loved. The greenhouse was full of seedlings in various stages of growth, tomatoes and peppers and flowers that would be sold at the farmer's market come summer. Clara's corner was busy from morning until evening with the sound of saws and sanders and the voices of young people learning skills that schools no longer taught. On a bright afternoon in late April, Howard stood in his workshop teaching 3 teenagers how to measure twice and cut once, showing them how to read the grain of wood and work with it rather than against it. And in the corner of the barn, 2 veterans in their 30s worked on building raised garden beds, while Howard offered suggestions and encouragement. A van pulled into the driveway and a local news crew emerged. A reporter and a cameraman who had heard about what they were calling the blizzard miracle and wanted to do a feature story for the evening broadcast. Howard was reluctant at first, uncomfortable with attention, but he agreed because he wanted to honor Marcus and David's memory, wanted the world to know about the debt that had been repaid and the ripples that had spread from a single act of kindness 57 years ago. During the interview, standing in front of his restored barn with the spring sun warm on his face, Howard told the full story from beginning to end, from Vietnam to the blizzard to the transformation of his farm and his life. He emphasized that it was not about one man's kindness or another's gratitude, but about remembering that we are all connected. That one act of compassion can change the world if we let it ripple outward. The reporter asked him what he hoped people would take away from his story. And Howard thought for a long moment before answering that he hoped they would see the strangers in their own lives, the people struggling silently, the neighbors who need help but are too proud to ask. And he hoped they would have the courage to reach out before it was too late. The interview aired that evening, and by the next morning it had been picked up by national news outlets, shared thousands of times on social media, viewed by millions of people who were hungry for stories of hope in a world that often felt dark and divided. Late one spring day, as Howard worked in his garden, pulling weeds and checking on the progress of his tomato plants, he heard the distinctive rumble of a motorcycle coming up his driveway. He straightened with some difficulty, his back protesting after an hour bent over the plants, and shaded his eyes to see Marcus pulling up on his bike, dismounting with a grin that was equal parts joy and pride. Marcus said he thought he would check on the place, and Howard laughed and embraced him like the brother he had become. They toured the thriving farm together, Marcus meeting the young people Howard was teaching, seeing the workshop in full operation, walking through the garden that was already producing lettuce and radishes and early peas. Marcus revealed that the news story had gone viral, reaching millions of people, and it had inspired dozens of communities across the country to start similar programs pairing elderly people with young learners, veterans with those who needed mentoring, those with skills with those who needed to learn. Chen Construction Group had created a new division called David's Brigade, dedicated to helping veterans and elderly people in need. And they had already rebuilt 40 homes in 3 months, all because Howard's story had shown people what was possible when compassion overcame indifference. Howard was overwhelmed, insisting that he had not done anything special. But Marcus stopped him with a hand on his shoulder and told him that he had done everything that mattered, that he had opened his door when he had every reason to keep it closed. And that single act had changed more lives than he would ever know. That evening they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the fields, the sky turning orange and pink and purple. And Marcus shared that his 3 daughters wanted to meet Howard, the man their grandfather had never stopped talking about, the hero of the story they had heard their entire lives. He extended an invitation for Howard to come visit California, to meet the family, to see David's restaurant that was still operating and thriving under the management of Marcus's sister, to stand at the ocean that David had loved and say a prayer for the man who had brought them together across time and distance and the mysteries of fate. Howard hesitated because he had not left Michigan in 20 years, had not traveled since Clara's health began to fail. But then he remembered her voice telling him that life was meant to be lived, and he agreed, telling Marcus that Clara had always wanted to see the ocean. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, and the scene seemed to pull back as if viewed by a camera rising into the air, showing the transformed farm with its red barn and white house. The garden rose neat and productive, children playing near the workshop, veterans working side by side with teenagers, a community that had been broken coming together stronger than before. Howard's voice began to speak, no longer part of the narrative but breaking through it to address something beyond the story itself, speaking directly to those who were listening as if they were sitting across from him at his kitchen table. He said that people say he saved Marcus's father in Vietnam, and maybe he did, but what Marcus and those bikers did for him was save something more than his life. They saved his purpose, his reason for waking up each morning, his belief that the world could still be good. He reflected on how easy it is to close our doors, to protect ourselves from uncertainty and risk, to stay safe behind walls we build from fear and suspicion. But every stranger is someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's father, he said. Every person struggling is one moment of kindness away from hope. The moral crystallized in words that felt both simple and profound. I gave them shelter from a storm, Howard said. They gave me shelter from despair. That is what we are supposed to do for each other. His voice took on an urgency, a gentle plea that carried the weight of his 76 years and all he had learned about loss and love and the resilience of the human spirit. He told those listening not to wait for a blizzard, not to wait for a stranger to knock on their door, but to look around right now at the people in their lives who might be suffering in silence. "Someone needs what you can give," he said. "It might not be money or a roof over their head. Maybe it is time. Just an hour to listen when they need to talk. Maybe it is a listening ear when the world has stopped paying attention. Maybe it is just seeing them when everyone else looks away. Acknowledging their existence and their worth in a world that often makes people feel invisible." The images that followed were a montage of life continuing in all its beautiful complexity. Howard teaching a young man to use a saw, his weathered hands guiding younger hands, passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Ruth arriving with her own construction crew to start a new project in the next town, the ripple effect continuing to spread. The teenagers from Howard's workshop displaying their handmade furniture at a county fair, their faces bright with pride in their accomplishments. Letters and drawings from Marcus's daughters arriving in the mail, creating a bridge between California and Michigan, between a family that had been saved and the man who saved them. The town holding its first annual kindness festival inspired by the story, people coming together to celebrate community and connection, and the simple power of caring for one another. The final image was of the workshop sign that read, "Clara's Corner, where hands build hope." And the camera showed people entering and leaving, working and laughing, the space filled with life and purpose, just as Clara would have wanted. Howard's voice returned one last time, warm and certain, speaking words that felt like a benediction. "Clara would have loved this," he said. "She always said that a home is not just walls and a roof. It is the hearts that fill it." Turns out you can build those too. One act of kindness at a time. One open door at a time. One moment of choosing compassion over fear. The screen seemed to fade, and words appeared as if written by an invisible hand. This story is dedicated to all the strangers who opened their doors and all the wanderers who found home in the kindness of others. And then came the final call to action. The gentle invitation that gave the story its ultimate purpose. If this story touched your heart, share it. Someone needs to hear it today. And maybe, just maybe, you will be inspired to open your door too. To be the person who changes someone's life. To start the ripple that spreads farther than you can imagine. Because in the end, we are all just one storm away from needing shelter, and we are all one act of kindness away from being saved.